Hello and welcome, I'm Tafara Gadamu. My guest today, Philip Briggs, is the author of The Bradt Guide to Ethiopia, arguably the best travel guidebook on the country. He has been in and out of Ethiopia at least 8 times doing the research to update his book. A very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I had your first publisher, Hilary Bradt, on my show when it was 6 or 7 years ago. I asked her a very simple question. Which one is your most favorite? And she said, The Bradt Guide to Ethiopia by Philip Briggs.
Yeah.
What do you make out of that?
Well, she's either lying or she likes it. I don't know which.
She does. She actually does, and she was very specific in what she likes about you.
It's been, a sort of a book sort of really pushed the Bradt name. Ethiopia and Madagascar have been ones that have just a lot of readers identify with, and they've sort of soared ahead of other competitive books and competing books. So they've been just flagship books for us, I guess, and I think those two more than any others.
When this first book came out in 1995, it was quite a revelation for many travelers, right? And you did the research a year earlier.
Yeah. It was a revelation for me, really, because I came to Ethiopia not knowing much about it. There wasn't much information internationally except a lot of negative things that have been written over the whole, the famine and the Derg era and whatever. And I just sort of really bust around. I just took public transport and went to towns and asked people what there was to see and found hotels and put it together. So it was a bit of a somewhere between a conventional travel guide and a sort of not quite what I did on my holidays, what I did on my non-ending bus trip. But, it was, I think people didn't know much about Ethiopia before that. And it was certainly the first book to really expose it to an English-speaking travel audience in the modern era anyway.
And you didn't plan your itinerary inside Ethiopia, right?
I didn't have any idea. I just basically arrived here. I spoke to Tony Hickey from Ethiopia he was with a different company then, and some of his guides sort of taught me through and said, well, when you get to that town, look for that church, and that guest house is about the best place to stay, and I was, great, and I sort of made notes and then went on and did all this. But fundamentally I was just sort of stopping where the bus stopped and kept going.
It's very interesting, because it takes forever. Then, that was 23, 24, 25 years ago. The infrastructure was very, very, very poor.
Yeah.
And B, you were working on a standard book, one of the best that I know as to date. And you just simply hopped into the bus and see what that travel brings.
Look at the first edition of it now. It would seem horribly unprofessional and sort of, literally, well, in this town I saw this place, or it wasn't as professional as a book is now. But
it was great for it. Great for for its time.
Yeah, the feedback I got was the same. People would write to me and say, "No, we went to that town and we found this place and it was great. So the next edition I put that in," and it sort of built up a bit of a word of mouth. Just travel information about Ethiopia, which was at that time quite lacking. Because, you have to remember, I think under the Derg, there was no unofficial... People couldn't just travel. You could only do it with a handful of registered operators, and you could only stay at the government hotels. So it was also one of the difficulties I had on that trip, and especially more remote areas like Gambela, is sort of people from the tourist office scratching their head and not knowing what to do with me. But I did have a letter from the ETC, as it was at the time, saying, he's okay.
Ethiopian Tourism Commission.
Yeah. He's okay, be nice to him kind of thing. So,
were people nice to you when you were traveling? Because, here is, there weren't many travelers, with white faces, white people, white folks traveling across, in the country. There were very few of them. And then
people were very, very friendly, very helpful. There was, I was sort of more of a tourist attraction, or I felt like the centre of attention a lot of the time, in a way that times became like you wished you could sort of switch it off and just hang out somewhere where you weren't the only white person around, really. But overall it was a really great experience, and sort of almost, I suppose, formative experience, and that it really taught me a lot about travel and opened up a country to me in a way that no other country I sort of really felt. I was so starting from scratch when I did a guidebook.
But you didn't know much about the country before you came here, right? Did you do some reading about the history, about culture, about people, and so on?
Bear in mind, again, this was all pre-internet and pre-Amazon, and it wasn't that easy to just sort of. I was living in South Africa, to just sort of get information about Ethiopia. I mean, you couldn't order stuff online. You couldn't. So no, I knew very little. I picked up as I went around. There was, in those days around the Piazza, there was a lot of second-hand bookstores, and sort of nosed around those and found the endemic birds of Ethiopia, or sort of tourist brochure, not tourist brochure, the ETC, the Ethiopian Tourism Commission, had very good booklets actually about the main attractions, sort of 32-page booklets, and you find those, and they were all out of print at the time, but, you could find that and pay 10 birr for it or whatever, and, racking around looking for that kind of information. And
how long did you stay in Ethiopia doing your research?
that was about 4 months, the original.
4 months? Wow. So you covered the entire country?
Yeah, I didn't get to the Omo Valley, I didn't get to the Danakil, which were both incredibly difficult at that time, but otherwise...
Impregnable because the infrastructure wasn't there.
Yeah. And it was the rainy season.
It was rainy season.
Which wasn't very clever of me, but there you go.
So once you had your research done, 4 months later, you went back to South Africa to sit down and write, right?
Yeah.
And was it overwhelming? What was it like?
Can't really remember now.
But in hindsight, it would have been really quite I don't know.
I think I enjoyed it because it was sort of, having been to these places and then sort of doing some research and finding out what the significance of them was. And, sometimes that happens when you do a guidebook to a country where there isn't much information. So you sort of, run around looking at things and finding things out and pick up these books and then actually get back home and sort of read this and, okay, that's what this is all about, and then sort of look forward to going back for the second trip because you'll actually understand what you're seeing a lot better. But yeah, I enjoyed writing it actually.
What was the first reaction like when the book came out?
A lot of people did. It was, because at that point there's a lot of interest in Ethiopia, and I think virtually everyone who came, there weren't any other guidebooks at that point, not in English anyway. No. So, I think some of the operators were pretty happy about it because it got some information out there. And I think one of the things a book like that does is a country like Ethiopia has, and we all know it has a relatively negative international image. People mostly, if you say Ethiopia, the first thing they think is drought, famine, war, negative things. So, just putting a book in a shop and that someone can walk into a Stanford's or wherever in London and there's, a whole row of these 300-page book about Ethiopia is obviously just reassuring from a point of view. If you think go to a country and somebody's put that amount of information together, it makes you feel it must be at least safe and manageable and there's something to see. So it was a great feeling from that point of view.
Since then, you have revised your book, 6-7 times?
Yeah, either I or someone else. I haven't always done it myself. But yeah,
right.
I'm actually working on the 8th edition now. It's every 3 years, so it's 24 years since the first one.
So much has changed in the last 23 to 24 years.
Yeah.
Can you put that in perspective for me?
I don't think I can even put it in perspective for myself. It's something about 10 times a day as I walk around different towns. I'm just thinking like, wow, that's changed. But
change in what sense?
Well, obviously the infrastructure. If you think back then, I don't think there was a stretch of tar road outside Addis. When you went, the whole northern circuit was mud and insane sort of cliff roads and things like that. In most towns back then, I'm talking now from a tourist infrastructure point of view.
Right.
There was, if the bigger towns, there was the government hotel, the Ethiopia hotel chain, or the Ras chain, or the Yon chain, or whatever. And then there were just a bunch of like little places that, around a courtyard with a shower in the back, and you paid 6 birr for your little quadrangle with a bed in it, and an extra birr if you wanted a shower. Cold shower at the back, and that was there wasn't very much in between. It was. And so that's from a touristic perspective. And also, people weren't... obviously places like Lalibela now have become quite streamlined. There's high entrance fees, there's guides, there's a whole sort of thing going on, and everyone who comes in is part of that machine. Whereas at that point, most of the places I went, they really weren't used to tourists at all. So
you're not saying that everything is well in place now. Not that.
The infrastructure? It's a lot better than it was then, put it that way. The road infrastructure has really, really come a long way.
But the hospitality sector.
The hospitality sector.
Many tourists that I have talked to over the years, either on the show or just on one-on-one off camera, they've always complained about the food being served, the rooms, the absence of water, or hot water for that matter, and stuff like that. There's pretty basic things that are pretty much lacking in those sectors. We haven't improved on that in this country.
It's improved hugely. if you went back 25 years.
Yes, if you are a constant traveler, you know the difference. But if you are a first-time traveler, that's a different story.
Sure. I think Lalibela has good hotels. I mean, there's 10 hotels there, any one of which would be the best hotel if you went to another town like Aksum, which for some reason has awful hotels, fairly uniformly. I don't know why. I don't know why it's gone that way. And, most towns now have a couple of pretty good hotels. But also, I guess, in season, those fill up quickly. And there are towns, like I say, Aksum, Hara, where there really is a shortage of hotels that could even be called middle standard for tourists. Yeah, even if they look good on the outside, the sort of hotels where you turn the tap and it comes off in your hand, or there's that sort of thing is a problem.
And noise pollution is.
Yeah, always get a room facing away from the road is definitely a message. And some, last night it was a dog keeping me awake most of the night.
Right. Once we are in Addis, let's talk about Addis too. I mean, all this concrete coming up wherever you go in this city. Mm-hmm. And most of them are either office buildings, commercial centers, or more likely hotels and stuff. What do you make of all this?
I don't know what to make. I mean, I'm not.
Is that a shock? Does it come as a shock for you? Or?
Well, it looks very ugly, sort of half-finished buildings. But I mean, when I was last here 3 years ago was when the railway was being constructed, and the whole centre of town had been degutted, the transport network, and it's quite insane to come back here now and see how it really has been pulled together, and the trains working nicely, and the roads either side of it are going well, and the traffic's back. Under relatively under control, except during rush hours. So, I suppose these phases are necessary in the development of a city. That at the time, it's like, will this all come together and will it work? But all over Ethiopia, there's construction, just huge amounts of construction. And Wukro is the town that struck me. Is there's sort of the old town centre, the new town centre, and the hypothetical town, which is like about 100 concrete blocks just rising up half finished and I'm not sure what that's about or what all these people building think is going to happen in Wukro in the next few years. But
do you think this is because of lack of planning, lack of vision in terms of?
No idea. I mean, it's not something I have
experienced it elsewhere in Africa.
You do see it, the sort of half-finished building syndrome. It is a thing. I think often people just start buildings and then they don't have the money to finish it. And unfortunately, it does uglify places. If you've got a beauty spot with 5 half-finished hotels in between the 3 finished hotels, it doesn't look, it detracts from the whole sort of look of the place. But I don't really have an opinion about it one way or the other.
Okay. Well, I understand. You've spoken about the major tourist destinations like Aksum, Gondar, Bahadar, and so on, Harar, and so on. There are other locations of interest as well. Nature, wildlife. I mean, when you think about Ethiopia, writing in your book, I know what you write in your book. You talk about a multitude of things as attractions in this country, nature, wildlife, and so on. The diversity is quite immense, is it not?
Yeah, it is. I think one of the sort of sad things to me about tourism, the tourist industry, and I've observed in Ethiopia, is when the first edition came out, you felt like people came here, they just travelled around, they saw something in the book, or they went and operated and did different things. And as more tourists come, it's almost like it gets more channeled into like you do, 2 nights Bahadar, a night in Gondar, Lalibela, on to Mekelle, Danakil, down to South Omo, and all these really interesting places that aren't on that particular network are actually almost getting less tourism, I suspect, than they were 10 years ago, or certainly a much lower proportion of it. I think the industry just has a tendency to funnel people. You've got all these things like TripAdvisor and everyone rating the same things and pushing people to go to the same places. So it is. There's a lot of parts here. Gwasa Plateau, I was talking to someone about that last night, is a stunning place with Ethiopian wolves, with lots of geladas.
About 2 hours drive from here, yeah.
And, just people don't really know about it. And there's so many obscure Rockian churches sort of scattered around, apart from in somewhere like Tigray, people tend to visit the same 2 or 3 churches. And everything pushes to, like, this conformity, and it's a sort of feature of tourism everywhere. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because obviously with something like a Rockian church, the more tourists visit it, the more it starts feeling like a tourist attraction as opposed to the sort of organic, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, attraction that it should be. That you don't.
Do you think that it has ceased to be one, or is it on its way to be?
No, it's just a great. If you walk into rock-hewn church, and there's 5 priests in there, and people are worshipping, and you're the only tourist who's been there that day or that week. You get this sort of calm feeling of it all. If you walk in there and there's other tour parties coming through, and this guy's talking to these guys in Spanish, and this one's telling the Americans this, and this sort of feeling of people just it becomes more like gaping at something, and just removes perhaps the spiritual is a strong word, but the sort of the real sense of place and the real sense of mystery, I suppose, and the sense of just being somewhere, as opposed to like it being a tourist attraction, if that makes sense.
But we have also other destinations like in nature, wildlife, the national parks. You mentioned Guasa, which is I've been there twice, and it's really, really, really amazing. It's an Afro-Alpine, thing out there, the gelada baboons and Ethiopian wolves over there, and it's just amazing. I know it is, but also there are similar other places spread out across the country.
Well, Simien Mountains is really busy, and there's a lot of tourism going on there. Bali Mountains is much quieter, and I think in some ways more interesting, certainly from a wildlife point of view. It's not as scenic. And there's new RC Mountains National Park, which has only been formally gazetted, I think, a year or two ago. And nobody's really exploring that. There's Buna Yosef is part of a new conglomeration of national community reserves, run as a regional by the Amhara region in near Lalibela. And so all these things are developing, and it's really good. There are operators who are trying to push people to do the 3-4 day community hike around Lalibela, and that gets people out spending money, seeing different things, without it being a sort of wham bam. You've seen this.
Right, which is really crazy. Yeah. So you're saying that people tourists are not attracted to those places? To those places you just mentioned?
I think they're often, they're just not that aware of them, or they're just, what are the top 10 things to do in Ethiopia? And people come in and think, well, like if you go to South Africa or Kenya, if you go to South Africa, you say, well, I want to see the Kruger Park, and I want to see Cape Town, and I want to see that, and I want to see that. And by the time you're finished, there's not really time to go and do other things. So the more there's a sort of awareness of these are the top 5 attractions in a country, the more everyone who goes there feels they have to see those attractions, and just doesn't have time to go away. They might afterwards think, well, it'd be nice to have got more off the beaten track.
So the whole intervention is misguided. Is that what you're saying? Or in a way, I mean, that that tourists are tuned to specific locations, and they're not allowed to have time to explore others. No, or the way their itineraries are developed by tour operators. I don't know.
It's the way things tend to develop. People just, I think, with any country, it's just natural. It's sort of when people don't know much about a country, they're more inclined to just go there and sort of wander around and think, oh, I'll go there and I'll go there. Once they know that, like, these are the 4 things you've got to do, those are the things they're going to do.
When you're on location, traveling across the country, when you run into a tourist in a bar somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and you strike a conversation, what do people tell you about their travels?
I think mostly people are more busy with logistics. I don't know. Sort of
meaning?
How to get here or how to get there or whatever. But I think the Danicles become hugely, hugely popular. I mean, that's sort of mind-blowing. I think, I don't know. I wouldn't say there's some sort of consensus there. Like, I think, tourists tend to pre-select themselves. Yeah. Ethiopia is not a country for people who want a beach holiday. It's for active, mentally engaged sort of tourists who want to see historic sites and cultural sites or interest in the wildlife or the scenery, but in a active, not in just sort of passive way. I think you'd only get people very negative if perhaps they were sold the wrong country by an operator who doesn't, who may be told that like Langano is the equivalent of hanging around on the Indian Ocean, which it really isn't. Something like that.
The Ethiopian Tourism Ministry had this vision of making Ethiopia one of the best 4 or 5 destinations in the African continent. Are we inching in that direction?
I think there's an awareness among people who travel, but the moment you're with people who wouldn't travel particularly, people who more say go to Mauritius or go to somewhere in Europe, as well, Ethiopia, where's that? Isn't that dodgy? That would be the general feeling. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people would just say that about Africa in general. Africa's a dodgy place. Don't travel there; it's dangerous. So, it's difficult to get around that kind of thing. I wouldn't say right now that Ethiopia is one of the top 5 destinations in Africa in terms of numbers or in terms of profile. I think it's possibly, if you were going to put a list of 5 countries that have the most unique, different things to see that you can't replicate in another country, by which I mean if you go to Zambia or the Tanzania safari circuit or the Zimbabwe's national parks, you're seeing fundamentally quite a similar thing. I mean, it's a variation on a theme, whereas Ethiopia, with its sort of the cultural highlands and its endemics, is just totally different to anywhere else. So that's an easy thing to market from that point of view.
What do you think folks here at the policy level should do to be able to lift Ethiopia up as one of the great destinations in the African continent?
Most people, when they come to Africa, the first thing they think about is safari. They want to see big 5 elephants and all of that. Well, Ethiopia doesn't have that. So the second thing they're thinking is beaches and palm trees and tropical sort of sun and whatever. And Ethiopia doesn't really have that either. So I think it's always going to be a bit of a niche destination. It's never going to be a mainstream destination. And this, harking a little bit to what I said earlier, there'll be a point where somewhere like Lalibela would just be rendered into a sort of Disney World if there were too many tourists there. I don't think Ethiopia's attractions naturally sustain mass tours.
On volume.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of about diversification to try and, as happened with Geralta now, where there's 3 lodges in Geralta that are all actually very good, certainly by Ethiopian standards, very good lodges. And people can go and visit a lot of different churches, and each church is an adventure in itself. You hike up the escarpment, you visit that church, you come back down. That's your sort of half-day activity for most people. And there are enough churches there that if those 2 or 3 get oversaturated, you can go to the next one down. Yes. If you can just sort of find the priest.
But you have to be fit and much younger.
You have to be reasonably fit, and it's not hugely difficult. But
so your favorite destination in Ethiopia? Do you have one?
Yeah, I suppose going back to the very first time I visited Lalibela was just astonishing. I mean, it was just sort of, there was one other tourist in town. It was the end of the rain, so I got on the first plane up there because you couldn't get there in the rainy season at that time. And, just sort of wandering around those churches, and at that point there was still like hermits living in cells in the walls and sort of people walking around all the time. They were very much more actively used then, and it was just mind-boggling. It was like you felt like, you were somewhere between the 21st or the 20th century as it was then, and 1,000 years ago, the 2 things were happening side by side.
It was much more organic than it is today.
Yeah, but that would be absolutely my, I suppose in memory then, Italy, the volcano is quite stunning. And I sort of enjoy exploring, so I kind of often my highlights of any given trip at this point are finding some little church I'd heard about before but hadn't got to, or a ruin or something like that, which, to be honest, if you looked in the grand scheme of things, wouldn't really feature in the top 20 things to do in Ethiopia, but it keeps it interesting for me. So
great. Thank you very much, Philip. It was a pleasure having you on my show. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.